As the first speaker topic, and Antje and I had a conversation, we had several conversations over the last 6 or so months about how to kind of pitch it. As opening speaker, there's always a challenge with a diverse group like this, coming from different countries, different regions, different education systems, different disciplines or none. And then how do we actually start to have a meaningful conversation if we don't even necessarily understand one another's vocabulary or the core concepts or the ideas that, in a sense, lie behind or underneath these different concepts. So I'm going to try and do quite a lot in the time available, and it's useful for you then that these are being recorded. So yeah, if you want to go back over something later, there will hopefully be the opportunity. But if you don't understand something, or you don't understand what I'm saying or what's on the diagram, just put your hand up, and quite happy to stop and explain, because it's cumulative on a kind of rising curve. So if you don't understand some of the foundations because it's, you know, an alien vocabulary or concept or whatever, it will help to ask right away, so that we then share the understanding as we go through. So really what I'm trying to do is pull together some ideas that start to link up these different approaches to, let me say, critical urbanism or critical urban studies at the beginning, and then how we get from some of the critiques that have dominated discussions over the last 15 years or so within urban studies and the adjacent parts of development studies, and how we try to move beyond, as it were, the theoretical or the discourse of critique and deconstruction into trying to put something else in place, which is, if you like, reconstruction or adopting different methodologies that try to do in practice what those different conceptual theoretical ideas and debates have been calling for. The challenge is that for most academics, the core tools of the trade are critique and deconstruction, and that's kind of where it stops. And when you work, as I have almost always done, and in my current job it's sort of the bread, the butter, and whatever else is in the sandwich as well, of working in a transdisciplinary way, by which I mean between or among or whatever academic and non-academic or practitioner communities or communities of practice of different sorts. All of these issues and challenges are right up there. There's no escape. Because if you try to work with a local authority official or an NGO staff member or a representative of a micro or medium enterprise, or for that matter, one of the world's largest transnational corporations, and I do all of those things, sometimes at the same time, which is a bit mind-boggling, but sometimes at different times in different places and spaces. The first thing that somebody who doesn't do intellectual stuff as a career says to you is two very simple words: so what? And my view is, as an academic / practitioner, it is actually part of our duty to start to try to answer the so what, or at least to provide the tools, the how, to enable groups of people to explore what the so what means to them in their particular context. So that's really the idea that underlies this presentation, and sort of where I want to land up via some of these conceptual ideas in a very quick overview. Then I'll give you an overview of the work that Mistra Urban Futures does in this kind of space of transdisciplinary co-design, co-creation, co-production, and then give you some critical appraisals of our experience to date in our different contexts with different versions of this kind of methodology. And the idea is really to create a platform for you to discuss and debate, not only in the back end of this session, but going forward through the week. And what you'll also see is that I'll be bringing in some ideas which, as it were, don't perhaps necessarily come from or haven't really been engaged with in urban studies, but in the adjacent parts of development studies as well. So it's a little bit like an octopus, get the suckers out there, the tentacles, bring things in, mix them up and see how that enriches the overall picture. As I say, if this is new to you and you don't understand, please ask me to explain further. A lot of these ideas will come out again later in the week, but I could start in many places, but there isn't really time for a kind of archaeology of development studies. So I'm really here starting with the ideas which together come under the umbrella of post-structuralism that emerged as a profound critique in the 1980s of the way in which urban studies, development studies, social science more generally was undertaken. And the flagship at the time, which goes back even earlier to the early 70s in architecture, Yanks and people like that, was postmodernism. And broadly speaking, and again, I can point you to some literature, and I did quite a lot of work on this myself through trying to understand what it was all about, is you can broadly distinguish three traditions within postmodernism, and I argue that you can see those in post-colonialism as well to a large extent. The first one is the sort of chronological, the time period approach, where by definition post-modernism must come after modernism. Right? The problem, there are many, and there are lots of debates, is that modernism has not really finished, postmodernism has never really flowered into maturity, so there's a grey area, and you can't say, well, the modern period stopped on this date, and from that date we're in a kind of postmodern era. Then there's the sort of intellectual tradition, what in the sort of francophone philosophical approach would be the problématique, which is the kind of conceptual way of arguing. And this is really what has kind of come through into post-colonialism and various versions of post-traditionalism and other approaches as well. And that is, it's a fundamentally different way of thinking and arguing. It rejects the idea that there is a kind of rational economic person in the language of neoclassic economics, or that there's only one way of doing it, which is the right way, and there's only one answer. And it highlights the idea of different perspectives, reflecting different positionalities or disciplines or viewpoints, and trying to find a way of accommodating these in a much more kind of tolerant form of discourse and analysis. And then that's been transferred, and indeed that's where it started, with architecture and art history, the kind of aesthetic approach, where the idea of the pastiche, for example, is one of the key motifs, if you like, of postmodernism. So if you think about the way in which urban conservation works in terms of the cityscape or urban landscapes, the kind of modernist approach, and we have this in conservation areas and planning and regulatory zoning, and if you go down, picking up Antje's point about the history of Trier as having had successive colonial experiences and historical waves, you see the same thing. The idea that the buildings in a particular area should all look more or less the same in terms of height restrictions, in terms of preserving the historical idea of the facade as it was through the Middle Ages, and not sticking a 1970s brutalist concrete structure in one place and a postmodern glass and elevators on the outside structure next door to it, and so on. Now, the postmodern approach would be exactly opposite. Yes, turn that idea of different vernaculars, different architectural styles, and so on, into a virtue, and let's create a pastiche. Let's juxtapose things that most people think do not belong together and see where it gets us. At least it draws your attention. It gets people thinking and critiquing. And those ideas have filtered through post-colonialism and so on as well. Infused with often strongly anti-Eurocentric ideas, particularly some people like the idea of subaltern studies, which started in South Asia, people like Homi Bhabha, Dmitry Spivak, and so on. But I think it's inherently postmodern. It's also supposed to be empowering, as indeed was postmodernism, in the sense that it was also about, and that's the whole point of subaltern studies, starting from the point of view of the dispossessed and the oppressed and the historically marginalized, recovering their identities and using this. Social history attempted to do much the same in history from the 1970s, for example. Looking at the underclasses, the people who don't appear because they've been systematically omitted from official histories and the dominant narratives of nations and historians and so on, as part of a recovery of those lost identities. And the challenge of decolonizing urbanism, which is the kind of leitmotif of this workshop, in a sense attempts to do the same thing within urban studies. And a lot of what we have within social sciences already in terms of accumulated ideas and perspectives and successful or less than successful practice is highly relevant to this enterprise. And that's why I want to just start with this kind of framing to get you thinking. And very interestingly, a now sadly deceased former colleague of mine in Uganda and other people have in turn rejected post-colonialism as another Eurocentric device. You might think, how on earth could that be? Well, the answer they gave, and there is some logic, is that the idea of framing a whole approach, whether it's the chronological one, which, okay, you can't particularly argue with too much, but as an intellectual practice of post-colonialism and predicating it on colonialism is the Eurocentric trap. Because in many parts of the world outside Europe, the European colonial experience was actually a very short, sharp, brutal interruption of a much longer durée of history, which has indigenous roots, and in post-colonial contexts often, again, attention to either attempts to recover that or at least to sort of hybridize in a kind of modern way, not go back in a naive, nostalgic way to some kind of pre-colonial supposed nirvana. But then to see the European experience, which in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, was about a century or even slightly less, in some cases slightly more. Well, what is that compared to several thousand years of history and prehistory that we know of, and where the boundaries keep getting stretched by new archaeological or other historical evidence that gets uncovered. So they argue that we should think in terms of post-traditionalism, which focuses on the indigenous and this much longer time horizon, and see the colonial as the rupture, as the kind of alien interloper, rather than as the defining experience against which to look at what came or comes or is now being worked with after the end of colonialism, if indeed it has ended. And that's something else that we could usefully still debate. Because again, independence, new flag, new currency, new president who happens to be national doesn't necessarily mean that the inherited political economy or social economy or levels of external international dependence have changed dramatically. And if we look back over 60, 70 years in sub-Saharan Africa, we look back sometimes even 200 years of post-colonial in parts of Latin America, the colonial imprint is often still profound in its influence, not just on the cityscape, where it is perhaps most obviously visible. You'll see a couple of examples of this in a moment, but in the way the society is organized in terms of what are the key kind of global bases of reference and validation and all the rest, which are often so subconscious that they are part of the problem. And the fact that they are subconscious is part of the problem too. So if we now, and there's a good example of a carefully chosen illustration for this idea of anti and post-development or decolonizing post-colonial. That photograph happens to be part of the main cathedral, the Spanish cathedral in the center of Quito, the capital of Ecuador. And Ecuador actually has, I think it is the largest and certainly the best preserved Spanish colonial city, which was one of the first two UNESCO World Heritage Sites proclaimed in 1978 or whenever the program started, along with Krakow in Poland. And it's beautifully preserved. It's a huge global tourist mecca. It's really interesting. And then the rest of the city is outside. And they do integrate But it's also a really interesting way in which the Ecuadorians have, I don't mean memorialized in the sense of a museum or a bunch of statues or whatever. It is lived space. It is very much part of what is Quito, what is Ecuador, but not in a kind of historically nostalgic way. They're very much a contemporary, modern, oil-producing, aspirant, middle-income country, da-da-da-da-da. But the history is there, and they don't try to deny it or bury it. They respect it, they honor it, they understand how it infuses the present Ecuadorian state, which is highly problematic in all sorts of ways, of course. But that's just an interesting way of, as it were, being a little bit more comfortable with historical legacies, whereas in the immediate aftermath of decolonization, there are often attempts to obliterate, where possible, the landscapes that honor and reflect and resonate with that. And these are all things that we really have to confront, and which are still very live in the idea of decolonizing urbanism, or as some of the contemporary literature would have us talk in terms of decolonialization or the decolonial, which also not entirely unproblematic. So there we have a whole series of different approaches, all of which have something to say and are highly relevant to this idea of the challenge to the conventional Eurocentric tradition or Euro-American centric tradition within urban studies, and that's really what it's about. So I've just referred to the decolonial. There's still a very strong and influential humanistic tradition, phenomenological if you like, which tries to get away from the idea of structural political economy or whatever as the key driver, and focuses on the lived experience, the view from below, people-centric, and the sort of lived realities. And those of you who work in or on Africa probably familiar with some of the prolific work of people like Abdulmalik Simon, which is very classic in that sense, and he's all about the lived realities of the people in Kinshasa or Jakarta or Dakar or the various cities where he has worked. But it doesn't try in any sense to integrate with the perspective that say, yeah, so that's what these people experience, or that's how they understand in the favela or the shanty town or the pavement vendors or whatever, any more than the people who do kind of world systems theory or political economy try to understand that set of experiences and reality. And I suppose, again, because of my own concern to integrate theory, policy, and practice, or praxis, in some ways, I've always been attracted to that kind of middle space, or trying to bring these different perspectives into conversation. It seems to me that either one on its own doesn't really get us terribly far, other than saying there's another approach or there's another reality. So it's really all about, to me, how one integrates this. And a lot of my career has been trying to do exactly that sort of thing, which then brings us to the idea of transdisciplinarity and co-production. And most recently, this paper published in City a couple of years ago was explicitly trying to do that in the context of exactly what I've been talking about. So how can we bring these kinds of high-level discursive constructs of political economy, of social economy, of whatever, into conversation with the lived realities? Because the purists would always say you can't do that, that kind of debases the currency. It's a little bit like asking a neo-Marxist to talk to a structural Marxist, or a neoclassical economist to work with a neo-Marxist. Oh my God, no, 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 no. But actually, if you start to break down, this is just an aside, if you start to break down neo-Marxism and you start to break down neoclassical economics, they're actually on about the same thing. They use different labels, but they do map across remarkably well and remarkably similarly. And in some ways, they're just mirror images of a different understanding, the one very much sort of libertarian, individually based and focused analysis, and the other on the structures, on class, on conflict, rather than on entrepreneurship and individual self-benefit or profit maximization, if you like. But if you accept that they are mirror images, they do actually fit together and actually suffer from many of the same problems and limitations. So the real challenge of trying to do syncretism and hybridity is to explore how far you can go by saying, well, there's the structure, but what about the agency? Because the agency is real people. It is the people in the shanty town or on the pavement or doing whatever it takes to survive in precarious ways on a day-to-day basis without the resources or the figurative insurance policy of assets and so on to be able to take risks. And how does that fit? And when we go to choose any major city in Africa or indeed Asia or Latin America, the dominant discourse of the city fathers and mothers, the elected officials, elected representatives of the officials, is still very much a modernist planning vision in 99.5 out of 100 places. It's how do we get rid of these pesky people who constantly want to kind of clog up the pavements by doing these crazy things? And how do we bring order to the chaos of the shanty town or the favela or whatever? And the answer is get rid of them and build nice concrete structures. And for God's sake, we need air conditioning in every room and the latest energy intensive light bulbs, or now some of them are thinking about low energy light bulbs too, and so on, but which are completely antithetical to and hostile to the interests of the people on the ground, and who are the people who actually, for most part, make up the cities. So if we are going to decolonize urban studies, the challenge is to recognize those conflicting realities and the interests that they have and they serve in some cases. And they surely have to be in conversation with one another, because otherwise we're never going to get any further than simply repeating the planning mistakes and limitations, and indeed running over the same intellectual tracks again without actually taking us very much further down the line. So from there to Mistra Urban Futures, which, as Lara said in her introduction, is an international research center devoted to urban sustainability, but working through the promotion of appropriate knowledge built upon different forms of transdisciplinary co-production. So I already defined transdisciplinarity. Co-production or co-creation, co-production, co-design are the idea of bringing academic and practitioner communities, or if you like, different stakeholder groups together, not just actually to do the research together, but even to develop a shared understanding of what constitutes a problem. Now that might sound easy, but if any of you have ever tried to formulate a research grant application to a research council or funding agency, and you get 3 or 4, never mind 8 or 10 or 12 people from the university within one department, or perhaps from adjacent departments, some of you are geographers, some of you are economists, a couple of you are sociologists or political scientists, try figuring out and working up a text that makes sense to all of you, sitting within the same institution with the same kind of backgrounds and middle class experience and background and da-da-da-da-da. How challenging that is. So now bring together 1 or 2 people who are in the university, 1 or 2 people who are officials of the municipality or local authorities, some NGOs, some government research agency people, a couple of private sector people, and just think about some of the examples I used 2 minutes ago in terms of urban challenges. How do you get a bunch of people with such different backgrounds, institutional bases, and therefore the priorities and agendas and responsibilities to agree what is a problem? Are the pavement vendors the problem, or are they actually fundamental to the solution? Is the problem to get rid of them and stick them in some purpose-built market miles from anywhere where nobody ever passes and they're never going to sell anything? Well, that's what happens 9 times out of 10 if the planners are allowed to control the process. Is the solution to let them block up all the pavements by selling as much stuff as they like and then forcing pedestrians into the road and so on? Well, probably not either. But there's a whole lot in between those 2 extremes. And I suppose in the simplest terms, the logic of this kind of approach to co-production is if you get the people who are, as it were, traditionally opponents within urban planning or policy or intellectual practice and professional practice, to sit together and discover that underneath all that hostility and stuff, they're actually all human beings, and that they probably have more or as much in common as that which divides them. And there's no easy recipe, there's no magic solution that says, well, if you sit for 3 hours, let's put in the timetable from 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock, then we all go and have lunch, and by afternoon we start to solve the problem. It doesn't work like that. It's complicated, it's time consuming, you have to break down those barriers, you have to build a certain confidence, and as with anything else, it depends as much on the personal chemistry as the sort of structural positions of the institutions or the stakeholder groups that these people you're bringing together represent. So it's really challenging. It's impossible to predict the timetable, and it's also impossible to predict the outcome. And I suppose one of the key lessons, I'll come back to this later on when I try and draw together these different strands, one of the key things is that it's experimental by definition. You cannot, any more than with anything else, develop a kind of blueprint. You can't say, okay, we did this in Gothenburg, in Gothenburg. Here it is, go away and do this in Jakarta or Harare or Port-au-Prince or wherever, and it'll work. The only thing guarantees it won't work. What we can try and do is draw out, and this is really what the work of Mistra Urban Futures is about, through our comparative experiences in the different cities where we have these transdisciplinary platforms, is to draw out the extent to which we can generalize about the conditions or the preconditions, or what were the underlying, as it were, seeds in the recipe that worked in a particular place, as opposed to what was the sort of local specificity, and then try to draw out guidelines of good, but not best practice. It's different from expert knowledge, and encourage other people to try to work through it. But this doesn't sit very easily with the kind of conventional planning approaches which are obsessed by the financial year and the annual accounts and the 2 or 3 year planning horizons and budget cycles that local authorities and institutions, and indeed our funders, work to. So a lot of our time is spent, well, I would say tearing hair out if I hadn't already lost it all, in how we reconcile the kind of experimental and imprecise and unpredictable nature of the enterprise with these very rigid and bureaucratic reporting requirements that our funders, who are up there on the board, want us to do, but still expect and require us, after years of debate and argument, to report and fill in the log frames and fill in the annual budget cycles and this, that, and the other. And I've got a board meeting on Tuesday where the board is very concerned that we haven't spent as much as the budget cycle predicted. Yes, because we're starting up new platforms and it's time consuming, and to build the institutional partnerships on which our work depends, never mind get the projects going, has taken a few months longer. So we kind of, we're a little bit behind where we've planned it to be, but that's normal, and okay, we'll get some more researchers on the case, and we hope once we've built the foundations that we'll make up for that in terms of more rapid progress. But we're constantly juggling this kind of contradiction, or this wonderful German word Zwiespalt, between trying to and wanting to do this, and the funders want us to do it, which is after all why they've given us the money, but on the other hand, they can't cope with us not being able to report in a way that fits that rigid bureaucratic mechanism that they are required or adhering to for their own institutional and bureaucratic and political reasons. And then when it doesn't fit, they create a problem. Well, what are you going to do to make up the backlog? Why are you behind schedule with your expenditure? Yeah, well, that's linked to our raison d'etre. Huh? That's the sort of challenge that one faces with this kind of thing. Okay, I've already covered that. So there's a nice picture of the Göta River running through the center of Göteborg, and gives you a flavor of the older part of the city. But by the time of our so-called midterm review, about almost 2 years ago now, we'd completed in the 4 cities where we worked at that time over 70 projects, employing at various times involving 600 people, and had produced 500 or so publications, now a whole lot more. And the way we worked in phase one was through these partnerships on individual projects within one city. So in Gothenburg, the projects were purely in Gothenburg, in Cape Town, in Kisumu, in Greater Manchester in the UK. And now in the second phase, we're doing comparative research to try and draw out the lessons between similar projects that work on, for example, urban agriculture and food security, and projects that address the current challenges of segregation, rapid migration, and integration or disempowerment within cities. And it may sound strange, but that is today the dominant concern of the city of Gothenburg. Because as many of you know, Sweden admitted per capita the largest number of refugees and migrants in 2015. It was less than the absolute number here in Germany, but per capita in relation to the 7 or so million Swedes, a much higher number than per capita in Germany. And many of the same anxieties and political tensions and day-to-day practical realities that those of you who live and work in Germany know all about are driving public discourse and policy, not quite as politically, vocally necessarily at the national level, although there is an element of that, but at the local level, for example, this is the top priority of the city of Gothenburg right now. So we are working with them to create projects and address this, and that's, in different ways, a key concern for the cities in our other platforms as well. Here, very quickly, and I'm not going to read them out or elaborate, you can just read them as I talk, are some examples of the projects in Gothenburg that were completed by about 2015. And they give you a flavor of the way in which we're thinking about and trying to work on different challenges of urban sustainability of interest to several of the partners in our consortium. And this one, for example, the divided city, shared city, is the forerunner of what I was just talking about, the new comparative project that we're setting up that addresses residential segregation, unemployment, poverty, deprivation within the surprisingly strongly segregated city of Gothenburg, which, given its history of the last 30 or 40 years of strongly social, democratic and progressive urban policy, might seem surprising. But the places where the recent waves of poorer migrants, refugees and so on have settled for all the usual reasons of availability and affordability of housing makes them highly segregated. And they're also far out from the city, and there are fewer job opportunities, and access to various local and national services are quite constrained. And so this is feeding through into the sort of policy imperative that the city is facing. And if you go down to southern Sweden, to Malmö, the third city, exactly the same there. And again, proportionally, it's even a bigger issue because it's a smaller city of 250,000, 300,000 people. Even in Stockholm, which is, 1.5 million, getting on for 2 million now, the same sort of issues are there. And what we're now doing, because we have a new presence in Stockholm as well as a platform in Malmö, is actually getting the 3 Swedish platforms to start to collaborate and share experiences on how they're going to deal with this going forward. One of the other interesting and very valuable projects was called Kairos. And this is about social sustainability, ways of working. I don't just mean paid employment, but more generally. And coming up again with the need for a completely different approach if we're really going to get to grips and try to make a difference in terms of addressing these sorts of problems. The WISE project, a lovely acronym because it's actually quite wise, Wellbeing in Sustainable Cities. It was all about lifestyles and how we might reduce our carbon footprint as individuals and families, not just as a municipality or as a community. And the work of this fed directly into and was quite influential in the process that led to Gothenburg being one of the first cities anywhere that produced a comprehensive climate strategy a couple of years ago, in terms of very specific measures and commitments to reducing the ecological footprint, reducing emissions, and all the rest of it, which is now being used internationally as a sort of model of good practice, along with the New Yorks and one or two other similar examples, London and so on. But when you bear in mind that Gothenburg is a sort of intermediate city of roughly 500,000 people, not a mega city like New York or London, that is both more remarkable, but also, of course, means that it's perhaps easier in some ways to make a difference through coherent policy than in a much more complex megacity environment. So, as I was saying, in our second phase, which is running right now, we're doing comparative research with the vision and the mission, which are very simple up there, on sustainable urbanization as cities which are accessible in terms of not just physical accessibility, although that's an important part in terms of transport and mobility issues, but affordability, availability, being at the same time green, and that's more than physically green. It's not just the aesthetic idea of planting trees, although that's obviously very important in one sense for carbon sequestration, to counteract heat island effects and so on. And then crucially also fair in the sense of social, environmental, and economic justice. So there's a strong normative element, and that's where all the sort of equity and distribution issues really come in. And crucially, we argue that you need all three of these as a kind of triangle, if you like, to constitute a meaningful or holistic approach to urban sustainability. And we published last year a book which is available, open access, free to download, and I'll give you a leaflet later on which has the link, as well as to a book on our co-production experiences so far, where we've done these comprehensive literature reviews worldwide on experience, knowledge about these three core attributes of urban sustainability. And crucially, as indeed are our sort of network of cities, as far as we know, unique in the sense of being both in the global north and global south. So it's not a European network claiming to be globally relevant, or an African network claiming to be globally relevant. We have this combination, and we're opening new partnerships in Latin America and Asia as well to have a foot in other continental regions to be able to reflect and to draw on those traditions and experiences and trajectories as well, as important as and diverse as they are. So our agenda for these 4 years is called Realizing Just Cities. And again, the idea of justice and fairness and equity being absolutely fundamental to avoid the disparities and reduce the disparities, the inequalities, the exclusion, which undermine any meaningful sense of urban sustainability. Another way of putting it, I suppose, if we think of urban greening, the tradition in Europe, North America, Japan is very much a kind of aesthetic tradition of parks, open spaces that go right back to the origins of urban planning and Baron Haussmann in Paris, and Lutyens and various others, and even before that, some of the royal and elite circles in the UK in the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th century, with the idea of public parks being linked to public health, needing space, needing fresh air. They didn't know about carbon sequestration, all that stuff at that time, but they'd understood that living in very dense, polluted, sewerage and refuse-infested places that look rather like many shanties and slums and townships and favelas today doesn't work for people's health. And that origin is still there, and the idea of public parks and nice flower beds and so on, a sort of attractive green aesthetic being a nice place, a gemütliche environment, if you like, to live in. But in the context of the urban majority world, that is often, again, contrary to their kind of immediate material interests. If you plant up places with decorative trees and flowers, you can't use it for cultivation to earn a living or to supplement your nutrition through growing fruit and vegetables close by. So it's all of those things, and indeed what is really interesting is how even in parts of Europe and North America now, that kind of approach, whether it's focused around urban and peri-urban agriculture, whether it's focused around food markets, farmers markets, and reducing food miles from importing food, air freight halfway around the world, is giving a whole new meaning to urban space and production and greening, which does the carbon sequestration stuff, it does the heat island stuff. It's also about getting people actively involved in producing something, getting their hands dirty in soil and compost and manure within the cities. And this is sometimes generating new cooperatives and other innovative forms of food production and sharing. It's about urban sustainability. It brings different groups of people together to overcome these suspicions of new refugees or foreigners or other ethnic or religious groups. And so again, many of these interventions, if they are successful, are characterized by what we call co-benefits. So, the initial objective might be one thing, but if you structure it correctly and you can engage communities, you can actually achieve multiple benefits with one carefully targeted and calibrated and locally embedded intervention. And that is the sort of way in which, through these micro experiments, we find that it's actually possible to influence much broader agendas. So it's a kind of bottom-up, community-driven based or local partnership-based series of interventions, but which have potential to spread through urban areas. You can have demonstration sites or plots, but it's not, as I said, about expert knowledge and best practice. It's about good practice and what are the key features that enable this to work successfully here, and why did something similar there not work successfully? What are the differences? What are the lessons we can learn? And then how can we put these out there as guidelines for good practice that people necessarily will need to adapt to local circumstances? So that's one of the key strengths. It's also one of the key challenges, because as you know, people, politicians, ordinary people, everybody really wants quick fixes. We have a crisis, we have a problem. We want the answer preferably by yesterday afternoon. So I want a blueprint, I want best practice, I want a handbook that's going to tell me what to do this morning and this afternoon. And in 3 years' time or 5 years' time is just simply too late by the time this slow, organic, as it were, process of co-production has run its course. And that is one of the challenges. The time frame, the lack of, I suppose it could almost say scalability, in the sense that if we get it to work in one community here, doesn't mean that tomorrow the municipality can take it and do the same thing across the whole city, or that every city in the country or in the whole of Europe or the whole of wherever can take the same thing and do it as a kind of master plan blueprint. No, absolutely not. It's precisely the opposite ethos. So that is its main value, that is its main importance. But in terms of providing instant solutions or quick fixes, this is not the ultimate way forward. The origins of pressure and so on for co-design, co-creation, co-production are very diverse. And what we're finding is that there is now, apart from the literature on co-production growing through academics engaging and so on, but actually through practice-based experience in different parts of the world. So across all regions and cultures and linguistic and cultural and political realms, there is a lot of work and experimentation going on under this umbrella of co-production. But like everything else, not everything that people brand as co-production is what, those of us who sort of do this for a living, as it were, would necessarily recognize it as such. So there's a lot of kind of, a bit like in urban greening, there's greenwash, where you have, big companies saying, oh, we do the following, we recycle our plastic cups by the water fountain, or we, buy recycled plastic water cups in the first place, or whatever it is. And isn't this wonderful? That's greenwash. It's providing a kind of superficial cloak of respectability, where the core business is probably still with a dirty chimney spewing out fumes or unpurified water back down into the river below the factory or whatever. So that sort of opportunistic approach is evident in the literature on co-production. So I guess what I'm saying is be a little bit careful. Lots of things now use the word. I was asked to read a rough draft grant application by a colleague the other day, I mean literally end of last week, which isn't about co-production at all. But they're going to run a bunch of focus groups in a particular place that will remain anonymous, and they're going to do this, that, and the other. Great. But suddenly, the focus groups become a form of co-production. Not quite. Why is it there? Because the funding call that they're responding to has a whole bunch of topical keywords there that they want applicants to reflect. So they feel if they don't find a way to put co-production as part of the methodology, they won't have a chance to get the grant. And the same sort of thing is happening in other contexts. So just be a little bit careful if you read about people are co-producing everywhere. Just because 3 people from a different department or different institutions have a conversation, or you run a focus group for an hour on something or other, that doesn't qualify in a sort of meaningful sense of co-production unless different people actually worked together and produced something that could not have been done by one or the other without sort of being together. But our way of doing that is through these institutional partnerships, which creates the accommodation and everything else, but takes a lot of time and energy both to create and establish, to create the funding, the political buy-in, but there's a lot of homework to be done, as it were, that keeps that going. But the original pressure or drivers, if you like, are very diverse. Could be about climate change issues and the challenges there of bringing different people together to arrive at meaningful resilience or adaptation or mitigation strategies or combinations of. It could be the challenges of segregation and anomie that I was talking about. It could be some particular transport and mobility challenge that the city feels it can't address on its own. Well, there's really what I've just been talking about. How together is the co in co-design or co-creation or co-production? The one that you don't hear or see very often at all is the logical end stage of the process. So unless the object of production is a thing that you're going to use, in the policy world, the sort of end stage should be co-implementation, where the findings, the recommendations, whatever that come out of the research process actually get implemented. Now, the difficulty with co-implementation in many contexts is that in the world we live in, the powers or responsibilities for implementation usually lie with one stakeholder, the city council, the water company, or whatever it happens to be. And so the actual challenge of co-implementation usually cannot be done jointly by all the partners in the team, but the others have to support and work with and provide legitimacy for the partner that has the statutory responsibility for actually implementing. And that can be done in diverse ways, like having awareness raising or public meetings or whatever before or during the implementation process to explain and keep the local community on board that this isn't a sort of top-down technocratic intervention by the local authority, but it's actually what has been produced through a co-production process involving the different institutions and representatives of the community working together. And that way you can bolster legitimacy and generally get a wider level of acceptance and collaboration during implementation than in the traditional way. I've covered a lot of this, so let's just run through the slides and then we can open it up in a few moments for some discussion. The way I tend to think of co-production now is not as something, as it were, totally different or new, but if we think about research methodologies as a kind of continuum or a spectrum, I see these, if they're meaningful co-production, as a kind of more extreme is the wrong word, but intense, holistic form of participatory research, which is a suite of methodologies that in different forms have been around now for 25, maybe even 30 years. Some of you perhaps will be familiar with idea of participatory rural appraisal, which is where one huge part of this process started. The idea coming out of failed development projects which were technocratic and top-down and donor-driven or agency-driven, and figuring out that actually if you're going to help poor, marginalized rural communities, you had to work with them, they had to be part of the process, you had to understand their worldview. So, for example, when seeing we're in Germany, let's use a German example, when the experts, in inverted commas, from GIZ or GTZ, as it would have been in those days, went and did a project and went away and left strict instructions with the village headman and his council that the following had to be done at this point in time over the next 12 months in the agricultural cycle. And they came back on inspection 1 year later and nothing had happened. They were completely oblivious of the fact that being, and if we stick with most parts of Africa, for example, most agriculture, most actual production activities are performed by women. So they'd been talking to the men because of the patriarchal society, the chief and the elders, and they'd given all the seeds or the fertilizer to the men and so on, and said, well, here are the household heads, get on with it. The problem was that they are not responsible for, they don't undertake agriculture or make all the agriculturally related decisions. And then because of the patriarchal relations and gender power relations within households and the communities, it never quite got to the people who had to do it, and they didn't see the relevance, or it was being used by the men to reinforce the unequal power relations, and therefore the project was doomed to failure from roughly kickoff, for example. So I see this as a sort of a bit like participatory action research, where you have an intervention that is coming out of some participatory process. You then research the actual intervention as a way of understanding how implementation works, how it's, as it were, received or either assimilated and made sustainable, or in fact rejected by the community. So if you go beyond that, then you start to get to co-production in the way that I see it. And getting beyond, or hopefully getting beyond, what in the literature has become known as the tyranny of participation, where again, because at one stage all the funders, all the donors, it's got to be a participatory project. Every grant application I read for about a decade was participatory. Now it's every grant application I'm reading this decade, or paper or whatever, it's about co-production. So that's the kind of branding, if you like, the positioning. But if we're talking substantively rather than kind of greenwashing our grant applications or our papers, that's where I see them fitting in. And then there's a spectrum of different forms. There are numerous different models of co-production. It isn't one thing. And one of the interesting parts of the process that we're busy with now is evaluating and trying to draw together the lessons of the experience of our platforms in the different cities where we work. Because each one mainly uses particular forms of co-production, and now we're starting to do mutual learning. So, for example, our new platform in Skåne in southern Sweden, in Malmö, they're really interested in learning about a particular city lab model that our platform in Cape Town has been using very successfully. So we're just planning later this year and next year to have some joint workshops and to start an experiment with a city lab kind of form of co-production in Malmö. And that link is facilitated because the two local authorities in the respective platforms, City of Malmö, City of Cape Town, have for the last 3 years now, had a twinning sort of partnership. So this is really interesting because most of the others, it's the universities that have been the lead partners, as it were, whereas here we have a municipal partnership which predated the establishment of the platform based in Malmö. And so we're using that to make sure that the municipal officials are at the forefront of the comparative work, not just the academics. And so there's a good example of how we're trying to, as it were, work in diversity and learn from it rather than trying to minimize it. So it's a different kind of comparative challenge from conventional work. It's not like, laboratories and fume cupboards, where if you're going to do comparison, you have to have a kind of reproducible scientific experiment where everybody is putting the same number of grams of the solute into the same volume of the solute in the same test tube in the same fume cabinet at the same time and counting the nanoseconds. Each of the projects is locally developed, locally appropriate, locally grounded, but they're in the same thematic area. And what we compare is the actual research process as much as the, as it were, findings, but it's both, and bringing those into and keeping those in conversation with each other. Yeah, this is roughly how I would summarize our experience to date, and I've again spoken through several aspects of this already. If you want an easy ride, if you're looking for the quick fix, if you're looking for the fastest way to a PhD or a successful postdoc program or the next promotion, probably not the ideal approach. And again, we have a challenge there, because part of our agenda in all our platforms is having PhD students undertaking research either in or using or at least on the co-production process. And certainly in some cases, and Kisumu is the best example, all the researchers to date have actually been doing PhDs part-time as full-time academics in one of the two universities in Kisumu. Many of them mature, they have families as well, and they're teaching 500 students in triple shifts a lot of the time and all this sort of thing, and still trying to do their PhD on different aspects of co-production. So inevitably it's slow and it's time consuming and it's full of delays and headaches and so on. But we're trying to shift that model and get a more diverse group. But it is a really interesting and important way, again, in all the different platforms in different ways, of getting a good skilled cohort of people with experience in co-production. And because they're working with local authorities or NGOs or research agency staff, that is part of a capacity building process that is creating a wider group of people throughout the relevant institutions with experience from their different institutional standpoints of co-design, co-production in different locally appropriate ways. And what is really interesting is that when we did the evaluation, we brought in some external independent evaluators for the funders. The words that came up in various of our platform cities was that the platform, if you like, where Mistra Urban Futures works, is thought about as a safe space. It's a neutral territory, if you like, where people can do this kind of experimental work in a way they wouldn't feel comfortable. So if we were doing all the work and having all the meetings, for example, in a meeting room in the municipality, the municipal team members would feel a little bit uncomfortable because their head of department or the mayor or whoever could kind of wander around and they feel constrained. Similarly, the private sector company rep, well, this doesn't fit the corporate model so easily, therefore, and so on and so forth. So because we're a neutral space, we have our own offices. In some cases they're in the university, in some cases they're separate premises. The people from the different partners find it quite comfortable, or gemütlich, if you like, in German, to do this. And that adds to the idea of an experimental process in an experimental space. And that brings me back to my starting point about the unpredictability, the imprecision, the local and even project-specific nature of each experience, and therefore the inability easily to upscale or to massify the learning and the experience and so on, which doesn't sit easily with the institutional constraints and so on. But, and this is absolutely crucial, many people think of co-production a little bit naively. It's probably not a coincidence that a lot of this work has its origins in Sweden or other countries that have a sort of strongly embedded social democratic tradition where the process works through trying to build consensus. The problem is we're finding, and this is one of the things that we are going to be flagging very prominently as we write up more of this work, is the assumption underlying this is that if you all get into the room and you can only talk slowly and long enough, you'll eventually find consensus. And if we don't get consensus by about the end of June, midsummer, when everything in Sweden grinds to halt for 5 or 6 weeks for summer holidays, well, let's reconvene in the autumn, and then by Christmas maybe no, that didn't work. Okay, let's start again in the spring semester, and maybe by next summer we'll have consensus. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes not everybody can or will agree, no matter how long you talk, how much aquavit you lubricate them with, or anything else. And there are lots of reasons for that. Any more than in a household or a family, you don't always eventually get consensus. Somebody has to say, well, I'm the boss, or I'm the head of the household, or it's a majority decision, or whatever it is. There is an assumption here that the power relations that exist in the outside world and exist in each of the institutions somehow evaporate when you get into this safe experimental co-production space. The sad news is they don't. So we might be in a safe space, we might be in a neutral space, but if the representative of the city council is talking, he or she has a kind of institutional weight or power behind him or her, which is very different from the person who is representing the small community-based organization or the relatively small and thinly staffed research institute. And you still need somebody to mediate the process. There is still ultimately going to have to be a way of figuring out a way beyond the roadblock, the impasse. And that's got to be worked out locally. So whether it's a vote or whether it's a majority or as near to consensus as we can reasonably get or whatever, and each of those is used in different examples I know, the key lesson is that power relations and inequalities and the gender relations within the room don't disappear. It's easier, it's whatever, but we make that kind of false assumption that somehow because it's deep and meaningful participation, action, research, co-production, that these realities of everyday life somehow evaporate or get suspended for this process. They don't. And nowhere that I'm aware of in the literature to date on co-production and transdisciplinarity will you find an honest assessment of these kinds of challenges we now find are absolutely fundamental. So I'm putting them out there. It's a key part of the new agenda, as it were, about transdisciplinarity and co-production. Just the same as, when you're in transdisciplinary work, there are academics and there are the non-academic practitioners, whatever, policy people. Those power relations can be very subtle. I don't know if you've ever been working in those contexts, but most non-academics somehow, unless you're in Trump's America, in a particular set of circles, most non-academics still have a profound respect for academics. Oh, you're so clever, or you've got a PhD, or you're doctor this, or professor. You know so much. How can I possibly, debate with you? How can I challenge those ideas? There again, very subtle, very implicit very often. And when you get to the kinds of contexts we're talking about, say in the Global South, where you're dealing with a lot of people who lack formal education, may be functionally illiterate, hell, how much stronger are not those sort of very subtle, but very, very powerful and profound unequal terms of trade, if you like, or terms of negotiation, even in a supposedly safe negotiating space. Some of you, many of you perhaps, have experienced running focus groups in those sort of contexts. And even there, you get 6 or 8 people who come from the same residential area or from the same employer or whatever. And even within that group, there are younger and older people. You can break it up by gender to try and avoid the gender-based issues. But even so, I've been in situations where you've had people of different seniority segregated by gender, so we put the gender relations to one side. But the junior, temporary employee, casual worker, apprentice, whatever, is never going to say anything that is radically different from what he's just heard or she's just heard the supervisor or the departmental head or the CEO or whatever say. And it's all of that and more within the complex mixture of transdisciplinarity and co-production. So on that provocative note, let's open it up, and if you want to throw things at me, well, that's fine, but happy to answer your question, or better still, engage in a debate.
So thank you very much, David Feynman. Maybe we start off with some question of understanding, and then also we will have the day of tomorrow for more deeper discussion. But maybe there are first questions of understanding.
Just a question about how you set up the new vision, for example. You mentioned that it's about green and fair cities. Was this part also of co-production?
Well, it's not a priori part of co-production, but it came out of our experience in phase 1, and we actually produced the strategic plan for phase 2 through co-production among the teams in our different platforms. So it took a whole lot longer than, I and 3 other people sitting down and drafting it and sending out for comment. We actually had one debate on the vision and mission and one debate on, the key urban characteristics that we wanted as the kind of leitmotif, if you like. We had, each section, each part of this was carefully and not unproblematically negotiated. And if I say this, it's true, but it was a radically different way of doing things from my predecessors as the previous 2 directors had done. But it's strange, but I actually do believe one should practice what one preaches. So if we're a center on transdisciplinary co-production, hey, we better try and do this internally as well as just telling other people how to solve their problems or the world how to solve its problems. And so again, from very first hand, even amongst a bunch of people who are, as it were, embedded in all of this and share the history and the tradition, it's damn hard work co-producing, position papers, strategic documents. I just finished a process. Well, it's not, the process isn't finished, but the next step is a paper to take to our board on Tuesday. We had a whole day-long workshop, and this is actually the vision and mission for the next phase, because we have to build a funding strategy, because Mistra won't fund me more than 10 years, so we have to figure out what we want, what institutional structure we want, and therefore what kind of funding would be appropriate, and then spend 2 years developing a funding strategy. So we're kind of doing this in year 2 of 4 of phase 2. But we had 3 virtual conferences on different aspects, then we had a day-long conference on in fact, exactly a week ago, Tuesday last week, just on the vision and mission, having done a SWOT analysis for each platform, then a SWOT analysis for comparative research, and one for the sort of center level, and then a day-long workshop. And that's just to produce a sort of 7 or 8 page vision, mission, strategy outline for phase 3, which the board will then debate. The consortium in Gothenburg is debating it on tomorrow afternoon, and so on and so forth. Then we get feedback, then we go around again. Then we talk to some other partners who are less kind of core and get their inputs and go around another process. So it kind of takes a long time and is a complicated, contorted process. And at any stage, people can want to go back and to start renegotiating. So again, one has to have rules that say, a little bit like, the European Commission, the Treaty of Rome, 1958 or whatever it was, a new member joins the EU. Well, you have to accept the Treaty of Rome as amended. You can't go back and start and say, well, actually we want to join you, but we don't like that, we want something different. By joining, you have to accept what already exists.
I had a question, because right now you're kind of working on this co-production and with the refugee situation. In this co-production of this planning, does it include actually ambassadors as refugees that are part of this dialogue?
Absolutely.
So they're
Yeah.
very much part of it.
Yeah. We have a secret plan to turn Gothenburg into the world's leading exporter of camel's milk.
Using them.
Yeah. Sweden? Camels? Camel's milk? Sweden, a world leading exporter of camel's milk? What the hell is he talking about? The answer is, like many other places, including Stockholm, Malmö, London, and many other cities, there is a large community of Somalis who've come at various stages over the last 20 years. Guess what? Camel's milk is kind of the foundation of their diet. Not a lot of camels, not a lot of camel's milk in Sweden. Where do they get camel's milk from right now?
Australia?
Exactly. How the hell did you know that? The only place in the world where there are lots of free-range camels and they don't know what to do with is Australia. So they're importing camel's milk, but it's so damn expensive they can only buy, a litre or something for some, special occasion. I don't know, Eid celebration, the end of Ramadan, or a birthday or anniversary or something. So as part of our urban food and urban agriculture, peri-urban agriculture problem, this idea came up in discussion between the Somali refugees and the project team. And so they've done a couple of levels of feasibility, and it appears, well, in Gothenburg, it's very rarely snows very much, never ice on the ground. So the camels will survive. And the question is, what about the food? So they're just experimenting whether, different kinds of hay or other things, or whether they can grow different things that will be, eaten by the camels. And so we're already, several steps along the way of testing this. And if it works, if you've got 20,000 Somalis in a ready market, and you've got another, 8 or 10,000 in Malmö, and probably the same in Stockholm. And then there's London, and then there's, and some in Germany, and some in, the Netherlands, and so on. Well, this could become quite a large-scale enterprise. And it will be, produced by Somalis, working with local partners. It'll create jobs. It'll use local knowledge. It'll do all the kind of right cultural stuff, and actually make economic sense for the people and for the Western Sweden and maybe even for the Swedish economy. So I just use that as a kind of great showstopper point, because it is so kind of counterintuitive that it really stops and makes you think. And that's the idea, that if one actually uses these methodologies in a meaningful way, and you're prepared to go into unfamiliar territory, if it works, and there may still be a whole bunch of problems, including a political problem that's popped up with the Swedish Democrats and other right-wing people in Gothenburg in the last 2 or 3 months, about the broader project, not specifically about the camels and camel's milk. It's possible that this could work successfully, in which case, what have we done? We've integrated at least a part of a very marginalized community, involved them in processes, which has brought them into contact with other segments of the community and stakeholder groups. So we're dealing with the alienation, the isolation, the anomie. It's created a lively, or will have created a livelihood for X people. They will see that as valuable, so they will feel valued members of their own and the wider community. It will be an innovative project that will probably bring people from other parts of the world to have a look and to study and learn. It will make sense economically, and it might actually add to Sweden's exports if there's enough produced that it can go to the Somalis in London or Frankfurt or wherever they are and beyond. So it's another very good example of what I mentioned as co-benefits earlier on, where there's a particular problem of a very marginalized, voiceless community, but because of this way of working, and they feel that being consulted is meaningful, not just pro forma for some bureaucratic purpose, they start to talk and think, well, we really would love some more camel. Where? What? Maybe we can. Surely not. Yeah, of course. Well, why not? Well, let's try. How can we? Yeah, well, we've got the project, we've got the money. We can bring in some agronomists, and we can bring in some people with that knowledge about this agroecological system in Western Sweden, and we can you've got the camel expertise, and we've got a bunch of camels we'll bring over on an experimental basis, and it may fail. As I say, the whole point of this process is that X% of your projects will fail by definition, or ideas will not run to completion. But if this is one of the 100 minus X that can be made to work, well, that's really going to be something.
So you can expect a paper on this camel production?
Yeah, you can expect a few liters of milk on the subject too. Ah, okay.
I wondered, in relation to one of the last points that you made about power relations within the co-production process, and also connected to the idea of what is real co-production, what does deep collaboration, genuine collaboration mean. I wondered if you could say something about if you have embedded in the processes or in the structure of working ways of grappling with those power imbalances.
Well, that's really where we are in the, in a kind of, well, a whole lot of stuff's been written, but there's a new effort we're just starting, which is really starting to pick up these. And again, it's the comparative lessons as well as the individual site-specific lessons. But I'm going to answer you in a sort of slightly different way, because just a month or two ago, I challenged the council of our consortium in Gothenburg, that they constantly say, well, you need to do this, or we want more from you in this way and that way, and dum. And I sort of said, well, we've been at this game now for several years, and you say all those things, and fine, that's okay, and let's try and do that. But how many of you can actually say that you have applied within your respective institutions the lessons you've learned from being involved in a bunch of these co-production, transdisciplinary projects through the platform, which they were instrumental in establishing and getting the funding for? And the answer was nobody. So I said, well, there's your challenge. You're constantly saying to us, we want this or do that, or why aren't you doing this, or dum, because of this complexity of stakeholders and all the changing demands and the political currents and everything, which does definitely affect us. And yet, I had to say to them, well, but hang on, what about your side of this? We can do and steer the teams, and we can make sure that as far as possible the projects achieve results. Whether you can actually implement them is one set of challenges. But so far they haven't figured out, or hadn't even realized, that they're not doing it. Let me put it as crudely as that. They hadn't realized they're not doing it. Of trying to learn the lessons of, why have we put so many 100,000 or million Swedish krona over the last X years into the center? Why have we sent representatives to be involved in, how many projects over this time? Yes, at one level, it's because, we needed that problem addressed, and okay, great, the staff have enjoyed it and they found useful things, and we're working on the implementation. But the whole idea, if it's really going to leave a legacy and be sustainable, is that institutional practice should change as a result of the experience of being involved. So it's not just, we want a solution to that, and to that. Can we please have teams to address them and then deal with the solution? There needs to be that kind of backward feeding, which we as a center cannot do. We can facilitate, we can encourage, we can mediate, we can go to meetings and help the process. But ultimately, it's the officials in the municipality, or it's the staff of the research agency, or the employees of the company who have to learn that lesson and, as it were, embed them in their own practices. So the ideal sort of measure of success in that respect would be if, let's say, the city of Gothenburg, or the city of Malmö, the new platform in southern Sweden, after a while can say, well, actually, the way we run our committee meetings across the different departments has completely changed as a result of this. So we don't work in silos anymore. We try and work horizontally. Or the way in which we do public consultations about new transport proposals, or new urban developments or redevelopments in the riverfront area, which is high-profile, big-scale stuff in Gothenburg right now. We've changed the way we do that and engage with the public and engage with different departments within our bureaucracy as a result of this experience. But to date, that hasn't happened, and ditto in all the others. God forbid the university should think about its faculties and hierarchies and do co-production between management and, as it were, ordinary academics and administrators in departments as a result of this. They're as far away from thinking about this or doing anything about it as anybody else. So, this is a challenge, and we haven't figured out how to do it yet, but until the institutions see that as a priority and then get on and do it, convene a working group and maybe ask some of us to come and say, well, how can you facilitate this? Well, I can come up again with guidelines, suggestions based on our experience, but I don't hold power in any of the partners, so I can't actually drive the process, or my colleagues. So there's another level of challenge. I'd be slightly disappointed, to say the least, if there was no more legacy than a project-by-project experience and the bunch of people who have learned through being part of co-production teams, but then can't, as it were, get on and do other stuff outside of the center within their home institutions, because the home institutions haven't actually changed their institutional architecture or their processes in a way that open up to the possibilities of a more kind of collaborative, co-productive way of working, both internally and in their external engagement. Does that help? Yeah?
I actually have the same question. Basically, how you address these very subtle power imbalances between, I don't know, maybe across gender divides, or also with knowledge hierarchies that sometimes academic or scientific knowledge is regarded as superior in some way. How you address this?
I don't know of any detergent or washing up liquid that will kind of, take these things away completely. So the best you can do is be aware. Like the example I gave earlier of the focus group discussion, you can try, where possible, to structure your activity to reduce the extremes. So, if there are powerful gender dynamics, okay, so you could have a segregated group to deal with that. But in many societies, attitudes to age are very strong. So, age equals seniority equals honor. So no young person will generally then contradict or come with a significantly different view from the chief or the elder or the head of the clan or the household or the factory work unit or whatever it is. So again, if you do focus groups for a living, as it were, or as part of your PhD, a good way to try to address that is to make sure that you make your focus group as homogeneous as possible. So if what you're interested in discovering, or maybe even isn't, but there's a strong kind of age-based set of power relationships, you structure, or you can structure your focus groups in such a way that the people in it are drawn from one stratum or two, as it were, adjacent strata. So you could have, let's not define them too closely, but you could have school children, or you could have youth, or you could have junior categories employees, and then senior management, for example, either gender mixed if that works, or if not, separate groups within each of those strata for men and women. And then you have to do the work yourself afterwards to try to analyze the findings that you get, and are the answers very similar from the different age-based or gender-based groups or professional categories, or not, and then sort of figure out. So the same here. The difficulty is, at least the way we work, we have no control over who each member institution sends to be its representative in that project team. As the director of the center, I can't say, I want you in the team, but not you, because, that won't work. It has to be each of the partners, institutional partners, they select somebody by their own process to come. Now, if it turns out that it's very clear in the working of that project team that institution X does not have the appropriate representative, either because of personality or position in the institution or expertise, then we might find a way very delicately of going back and saying, maybe you should think again and find somebody else. But it's very difficult, because again, the whole basis of this is that each partner is, as it were, able to operate both independently in its area of responsibility and interdependently within this space. Fortunately, that rarely happens, but there was one incident just over a year ago which threatened not only that project team but relations between two of the partners, and I did as director, have to get involved very subtly, very carefully, to draw attention of the line managers, of the protagonists, to the fact that there was a problem, and suggest, you know, in the best Swedish tradition, that a little quiet word be had in somebody's ear, and dum-da-dum-da-dum, and it took a little while, but we resolved the problem. But yeah, the short answer is you can't pretend they don't exist. You have to accommodate them. You have to think creatively in order to manage them, but being aware of it and trying to manage it in a subtle way is usually the best. But obviously in different, you know, political situations, I mean, I don't think you could do co-production in you know, Beijing or Shanghai very easily, because the nature of the Chinese state doesn't lend itself easily to this kind of way of working. It's kind of antithetical, and you know, there are other examples one could think of as well. Lorraine?
So, in terms of this co-production, how much progress has been made, or are we continuing to make, as far as global institutions like the World Bank and other institutions? Because you do find that there seems to be an opportunity to co-implement, but not necessarily to co-produce, or set up these global strategies or programs, but then you call for, you know, they call for people to submit projects or countries or cities to say, this is what you need to implement. So there seems to be that detachment seems to be growing even bigger. So I'm looking at this World Bank program, the pilot program for climate resilience, for instance, which has been set up. Then Mozambique was picked as a country, but the Mozambican government itself was not involved in sort of co-production, but they were being involved in co-implementation to an extent that the first phase really was just World Bank, and because they were told, well, this has to be done by this ministry, this has to be done by this person, you can't really change this. We can only sort of allow you to change it when it's in phase 2. So far in phase 1, when it had to be implemented because it had already been set up. So how do we get around some of these challenges? Because more and more, we do find that even cities themselves, even governments still have to work with these institutions. And the call for papers, for instance, your quality paper you're reading, if they want the word resilience in there, it has to be in there. But does it really fit within the context? You know.
Yeah, it's a greenwashing approach, and you know, that kind of co-implementation, I would say, is ultimately driven by cost reduction strategy on the part of the World Bank, and also, as it were, externalizing of risk. Because if it then fails in whatever way or for whatever reasons, it's easier for the World Bank as the funding/implementing agency to blame other partners and absolving themselves of responsibility. And that, one might argue, is actually irresponsible. And it changed the power relations, because it reinforces the kind of donor-driven nature of the animal without acknowledging that and pretending it's otherwise. So again, if you know, not a perfect analogy, but it sort of works. The way in which over the last 15 odd years, maybe 20, the global sugar industry has developed, or indeed the tea industry, with oversupply of certain categories of produce on the world market for a long time. So your big transnational producers that had their origin in colonial plantations have totally restructured. The Tate and Lyles, for example, of this world in sugar, the Hewlett Tongards in southern Africa, the Brook Bond Oxos in tea production, and others. They have restructured almost completely by getting out of owning and running their own plantations into an outsourced smallholder producer subcontractor based model. And they control very strictly, you know, which varieties of seed or cane or saplings or cuttings you take. They control the fertilizer and the pesticide regime. It's very strictly prescribed as contractual conditions, and that's the downside. The positive side they like to tell you about is that they guarantee a a good price to the smallholder producer? Well, if they manage all the risks and they actually get their crop, then they might get that good guaranteed price. But I know of numerous examples where the crop gets rejected because of some trivial apparent deficiency or whatever in the sugar content or the appearance of the tea leaf or whatever. So what that effectively has done is it has redistributed risk disproportionately from the previous plantation owner-operator transnational company to these smallholders. And so they buy the stuff, and if the crop fails, well, it's a smallholder who doesn't get paid. The transnational can then go into the world market and buy, free of contract wherever it likes on the spot market. So it sounds progressive. It does empower some smallholders, some places, some of the time, and they get improved income. But actually, they disproportionately bear the risk compared to the previous model. And that's really what drove it. It was world market surplus, uncertainty, downward pressure on prices. Oh my God, our shareholders are going to squeal. They won't like this. What can we do? And this has created a very powerful model to be able to reduce risk, appear progressive, help some people, but often disadvantage many others. And so what you find in some of the analyses that are coming out now of these models that have worked in Swaziland or Kenya or anywhere in between, even in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and tea all over the place, is greater differentiation among producers where some do very well, some of them all the time, some of them some of the time, and others basically get driven down and driven out. And so you've got rid of all the problems of labor relations in a traditional plantation and all that stuff. You've got rid of a lot of risk, and then you appropriate a higher proportion of the overall profit and so on, but externalize the risk onto the producers. So it's a sort of analogous situation, and it's not surprising that many governments, and the Mozambican used to do it, it doesn't do it very much anymore, used to challenge the World Bank, and there was a time they refused to take World Bank funds and IMF loans because of those conditionalities, and sadly now they find themselves rather passive implementers of the word from Washington.
I think we have to geographically shift our discussion, unfortunately, to the Mensa or the canteen.
Another discussion on vocabulary now, as you said in your introduction.
But thank you.
Happy to talk more in the Mensa or the canteen or the cafeteria.
But I guess through the discussion we realized that we had already an inspiring first kick-off keynote speech from your side, David. And we want to thank you with this Riesling, because we are in a wine region, so thank you very much.
Vielen Dank. Sehr nett von Ihnen. You realize, of course, this creates another problem for which we have to innovate a solution. Because I'm traveling with hand luggage only, I cannot take it home. So how do you solve that problem? How can you avoid traveling with a bottle of wine? That's the discussion for lunch.